Thank you, Eirik. Thank you, Civita, for inviting me. I will be brief, maybe even briefer than the 10 minutes, because I think most of you are not here to listen to me, but to my distinguished fellow panelists who aren't as often as me talking in Norway. But I'll give a few, first an overview of how Amnesty International views the human rights development in China, and then a few comments on how we believe not only liberal democracies, but generally all countries should be relating to China, particularly within the system of human rights that has been set up internationally. First of all, the human rights situation in China is deteriorating as we view it. The control of the state, and particularly the Communist Party, is growing and growing. We see it in many areas, and one of the more recent examples is the arrest of around 250 lawyers starting a year and a half, 2 years ago, and where still some are in prison, some have been released, and some are still awaiting their sentences. A very targeted attack on human rights, because what all these lawyers had in common was the fact that they were defending others' human rights. So very clearly an example of how the state is shutting down the space for human rights. We're also seeing anything you see across China, you will see even more condensed and, in a sense, more brutal in Tibet and Xinjiang, the two areas where minorities are contesting more or less dramatically the rule of Beijing. And we're seeing, I mean, the developments in Tibet that we have been seeing is that the suppression is spreading out of the urban areas, as if after the riots or demonstrations or whatever one wants to call it in 2008, I believe it was, they've taken more control of the urban areas and the suppression is spreading. So we are seeing people being arrested for crimes that were accepted previously. In Xinjiang, we are seeing a situation where thousands and thousands of bureaucrats are being shipped in to survey the population there, and particularly on religion. So we're seeing how the religious freedom is being, the room for religious freedom is being closed down, not only for the Buddhists in Tibet and the Muslims in Xinjiang, but once again across China. And we have examples, relatively fresh examples, of also Christians from the sort of so-called house churches are being arrested and put in prison for long sentences. So we're seeing a China that is, and the next step, in a sense, that is already here, is a mass surveillance that I don't think even the Americans are about to develop. There is talk about 1 billion faces in the face recognition system, and they are now experimenting with voice recognition. And I've heard, and which is a small number in China, I know, but that in Anhui they now have 40,000 voices on record that they are checking up against to really be able to create the 1984 that we, I mean, not the year, but the novel, that some people already have quite closely compared China to. In fact, a young man who wrote a blog and quite literally went through the novel and China and said, "This is China," is now in prison. But the surveillance system that is being set in place, I think, is beyond comparison. And of course, in any country of the world, this would have a very, very large effects on the right to privacy. But in China, you could also expect it to be used to pick people up, to recognize them, to connect stuff they have said or done, recognize their voices, their faces, and pick them up if they're seen as dangerous. So a system that would be sinister and problematic in Norway or in the US is even worse in a country like China, where not only does one use this to combat crime or security, but to combat thought crime and to suppress those who think differently from the Communist Party. Parallel to this, China has, of course, for years questioned and worked against what I would call what the human rights system is based on. The human rights system is, as you know, a web of conventions and international law that protects the individual. But since we don't have, and maybe that's a good thing, an international police that can run around and arrest people for violating these human rights, the system has always relied upon states criticizing each other and putting the spotlight on the human rights violations of other states. And over the last 25 years, the birth and development of an international human rights movement and within the civil society that has spread. I have worked with human rights since 1990, and the one really positive development I've seen, and I've seen things go up and things go down, is the fact that as Amnesty in 1990, we were working on behalf of people across the world because there were so few places with a domestic, national human rights movement. Now, it's almost only North Korea and Eritrea where that doesn't exist. There's always a possibility to work with our colleagues in countries. So that's the other part. The one part is governments criticizing each other for human rights violations. The other part is the existence of a civil society of human rights organizations, and I'm speaking in the broad sense here, that can criticize from within. And China fights both. Norway was in the freezer from 2010 until, was it late last year, December last year? Before that, Denmark was in a similar kind of freezer for having put forward a resolution at the Human Rights Council. So the fact that Denmark was daring enough to criticize China within the system where that is meant to be, put them in the similar kind of freezer, for not for as long, but still, that Norway was in. The different human rights dialogues that have been existing, the EU, Canada, Norway, obviously was a way for China to divert criticism in the public sphere, because these dialogues in general go on without the public, certainly not the Chinese public, but without the public being able to look in. So they have been very effective in diverting the criticism that is at the core of protecting human rights in the world. And you know, you might say that, well, so what has happened? There are human rights violations everywhere in the world. But this system has worked. This was put in place in 1948. And if you look back at the world in 1948 and look at it now, human rights has played a crucial role through this system in bettering people's lives. Not human rights alone, but certainly that system has supported the development to a world where a lot more people are able to feel that their human rights are respected. And when the country that has now, through Xi Jinping's speech at the Party Congress, placed itself as the other superpower of the world, is actively fighting that system, diverting criticism, blocking states that are criticizing them, at the same time doing whatever it can to suppress and, if necessary, imprison and abduct its own civil society actors within the country, this is a very, very serious attack on human rights. Not only in China, but across the board. Because China, with its power and its influence, is setting an example for others. I just heard on the radio that Donald Trump, and you should try to avoid talking about him every time we speak, but I just have to mention it anyway, because he just said that his relations to, or America's relations to the Philippines is brilliant. Well, this guy, the president of the Philippines, has ordered the killing of, up until now, 12,000 people, of his own people. And nobody seems to be criticizing him. Nobody is severing relations with the Philippines. And there is a massacre going on there. And this is part, I believe, of the same development that we are seeing, that states are shying away from criticizing each other or doing anything towards another state, even when the human rights violations are as blatant as what is going on in the Philippines right now. And in many ways, of course, it's worse in China. Although it's not as openly, it's not 12,000 people killed, but it is a strong suppression of all human rights with a particular emphasis on Tibet and Xinjiang, but across the board. And I'll just end by saying that if this is let to just go on and we stop criticizing, then we have to look out for Hong Kong. What is going on there and what the ambitions of Beijing is, I think, is very, very worrisome. And if nobody sort of sets down a milestone and really starts talking about this, that could be the next place where the at least few human rights and freedoms that they can that they have in Hong Kong will be taken away from them. So shit, I thought I would stop before. So my point is that, just to conclude, we need to safeguard the system of human rights that is between states. We need for states to be brave enough to stand up against China and criticize them. And Norway is, of course, now the sad example of how you can break a state that in general could have lived without that relationship to China because we're so rich. It ruins our sort of self-image politically because we weren't able to speak to China. We want to speak to everybody. But in fact, we could afford it. And we didn't. And we bowed our necks and said to China, we'll agree to anything you dictate. And that is so dangerous, particularly for the Chinese population, because it means that the Chinese government can do generally whatever they want, and other nations will look the other way. And that is a dangerous precedent in this world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jon Peder Egenæs. Stein Ringen, the floor is yours.
I wanted to say first three things about the Chinese regime. Three simple observations about what kind of regime this is that may help us to understand it. And the first is that China is an empire. It's not a country, but it is an empire. It contains within its borders other countries and other nations that have been integrated into the empire. It includes Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia perhaps, and others. But this is an empire. It's big. It's now almost as big as it has ever been. It has been a bit larger than it is now. And it is aiming to increase its size somewhat by incorporating also Taiwan into the empire. Now, the good news about this is that all empires collapse. The bad news is that it doesn't seem, in the Chinese case, that this will happen very soon. It could happen, but it's very unlikely that it will happen very soon. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that China is an aristocracy. China is ruled by a tiny upper class of the red aristocracy. This aristocracy consists of a group of men called princelings, the children, now grandchildren, of revolutionary and early People's Republic heroes, and others who are incorporated, co-opted into the aristocracy, as always with aristocracies. And Xi Jinping is the current leader, is the arch-aristocrat, the son of a revolutionary hero who has gone up the ladder in the usual way by doing hardship service in a difficult part of the country and risen to the top. Now, I think now that this aristocracy is consolidating itself in the sense that it and its leaders are becoming believers. They believe in their right and duty to rule the country, or rule the empire. And they believe, as all aristocrats do, that others, ordinary people, are not competent to look after themselves. This is aided in the Chinese case by an old tradition, tendency, to look down upon ordinary people, and in particular on people who live in the countryside, and to look down upon others also, which I would expect that is the experience with the Tibetan population. And the third observation is that the Chinese regime is a party state. Not just a one-party state, but a party state. And what that means is that it is governed by two overpowering bureaucracies, side by side, intertwined, that control each other and control society. The state bureaucracy and the party bureaucracy. And everywhere there are the representatives of the party bureaucracy, the party secretaries, from top to bottom in all state offices, all local governments, and down to the neighborhood level. In addition to these two main bureaucracies, there is also the big military and security bureaucracy, and the system is always concerned to maintain the unity, collaboration of these bureaucracies, and particularly the unity of the party and the military. Now, it is sometimes thought that China now is so overwhelmingly strong as a nation, both in economic terms and military terms, that there is nothing anyone can do to stand up to them. But I think that is not right. That is not right. And I think there are three things that can and should be done in engagement with China from the outside. And these are, firstly, that we should engage on all levels, politically, economically, in academia, in cultural life, and so on, engage with China. There are two reasons for this. One is that it is unavoidable, but the other reason is that when we engage with China, China is pulled into, to some degree, into our orbit and takes on commitments that come from that engagement. In my own field, for example, in academia, there's a big problem with China with cheating in academic work. And when we collaborate with colleagues in China, that helps them to understand and abide by normal standards of academic decency. So we should engage, should not in any way disengage with China. The second thing we should do is we should speak up from the outside about human rights abuses in China. And that we should always do with reference to Chinese law. Paradoxically, Chinese law is pretty good on civil liberties and civil rights. The state constitution lists all the normal rights that we expect. It doesn't count very much, the state constitution, but the letter of the law is sound, and we should always refer to Chinese law and speak up on human rights. And the third thing is that we should speak up about power abuse internationally from China. The acute issue now is in the South China Sea, where China is effectively turning a huge sea territory into territorial waters in breach of international law and in breach of a ruling in the Tribunal of the Law of the Sea against China. And we should always do that with reference to the many international commitments that China has signed up to. So we should speak up. this matters. The Chinese leaders are very, very concerned about how they are seen in the rest of the world. So speaking up is very effective and very important. As much as possible, we should do this collectively, but even individual countries can speak up and can be straight with China. And I can just echo what was said about the Norwegian case, which is a sad embarrassment that Norway, otherwise a bastion of human rights work throughout the world, has now committed itself to silence on the Chinese case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stein Ringen. Lobsang Sangay, please, the floor is yours.
That's the quickest introduction I've ever received when I go to speak in any of the panels. So we have from Amnesty International talking about more specific human rights cases in Tibet and Xinjiang within China, and we have Professor who enlarged that debate to talk more about China in general. Now, I'm sure as a Tibetan, you would expect me to go very specific to Tibetan case. That suddenly I realized that we should answer the bigger question of the session. That is, how liberal democracy should interact with China. That's the question. I think rather the question should be, you have no choice. The question is, should China become like you, or you become like China? That's the choice. So it's not a question of interaction only. It's a question of transformation of China like you, or you transform and become like China. Why I say this is President Xi Jinping recently has made it very clear in the 19th Party Congress. He has said from now on, Xi Jinping thought will be socialism with Chinese characteristic in new era, which means Mao Zedong era, they unified and made China strong. Deng Xiaoping era, market economy made China rich. Now new era is Xi Jinping's era, is they want to export not just one belt, one road, through one belt, one road, socialism with Chinese characteristic in the international frontier. What does it mean? It means no liberal democracy, no human rights, no environmental rights, no freedom of speech, socialism, one-party rule, but economic growth. That's what they're bringing to the table. And that's the choice you have. Should you accept that choice and become like them, or should we push back and make them become like you? Why? Because the whole discourse internationally also, because China sees there's a space, there's a vacuum, because now there's decline of internationalism, there's decline of liberalism, and there's rise of nationalism and extremism everywhere, including in Europe. In this discourse, international discourse, they want to come with socialism with Chinese characteristic in new era. Now, the good news is we have a good opportunity. Because if you look at China, there's debate going on within China. Number one, you know a Chinese guy called Confucius, right? So Chinese follow Confucianism, so Confucius is there. Then there's a guy called Karl Marx, because Marxism went to China from Das capital, Germany. That guy is also there in the same room called China. Then Adam Smith went from West and market economy developed, and Adam Smith is also there in China. And then Jesus Christ also been to China recently. All the missionaries are there. And they are looking at each other and say, hey, Confucius saying, welcome to the Karl Marx, and Karl Marx saying, welcome to Jesus Christ. They all are shaking hands. But there's one nice guy also entered the fray. Buddha. China happens to be the largest Buddhist country in the world now. 300 to 400 million Chinese are Buddhist. Now, among all these 5 men, I'm so sorry, woman is yet to enter. 5 men, Buddha has the largest members. But Communist Party of China has only 82 million. Buddha has 300 to 400 million Buddhists in China. Now you can clearly see, he has the majority in Norway, he should be ruling. But unfortunately, Karl Marx is saying it's me, and Confucius is saying it's me, Jesus Christ is saying it's me, now Xi Jinping is saying it's me. I am the new emperor. So among all these guys, they are forming alliances within China, debates. And Buddha, because he has the largest member, he is willing to welcome Miss Democracy in China. And Jesus Christ will support that. Even Confucius will support that. So this is the discourse that is taking place in China, and there is a golden opportunity to push back and say, China, we want you to be like us, and we don't want to be like you, ideologically. So hence we have opportunities, not like, the opportunity is gone. I know you are in Norway. So I know from 2010 to 2017, you went through cold tundra on the case of Liu Xiaobo, right? And this internal debate going on what to do. Now some people, yesterday I was talking, Norway is seen not in good light by the rest of the world. And they said, no, you can't tell us Norway. Norwegians are still good. It's the government. You must separate from the people and the country. And then they also said, no, it's not the government. It's just one foreign minister of Norway who happened to do this. I mean, you can blame as much as you can in Norway, and technically you're right. The rest of the world sees, Liu Xiaobo was given Nobel Peace Prize in Norway. And all the bigger problems started after that. And when he was so sick, when he had late-stage cancer, when he was released, German doctors said, we will take him and treat him. And Norway looked other way. You gave the Nobel Peace Prize. He is in trouble. And you don't say a word. People see that as Norway, Norwegian people, not the foreign minister of one party. And it's just not Norway. It's Denmark. It's all European countries around the world. The Chinese are putting so much pressure for economic interests. Hence, the choice between moral and money, people are choosing money. But then the amazing thing about Norway is the richest country which has every year surplus as far as GDP is concerned. You have the largest foreign reserve as far as GDP is concerned, around $1 trillion. You don't need Chinese currency with Mao Zedong stamped on it. But yeah, Norway also wanted that Mao Zedong currency, right? If you look at Chinese yuan, it's all Mao Zedong. And you have surplus, and if a country with surplus wants money and compromise your morals, then China says we are winning. We won over Norway, we made them like us, because Tibet is the litmus test. Liu Xiaobo is the litmus test. If you don't speak for Liu Xiaobo, if you don't speak for Tibet, next year they will tell you to don't speak about yourself. Don't speak about your human rights. Don't speak about environmental rights. No, it's a slippery slope. And Chinese strategy is very simple. If you have a piece of paper, they will say, you're a friend, right? Yes, you can keep the paper to yourself, but can I put a drop of oil that belongs to me? And say, that drop of oil is okay. That's Tibet's small matter, Liu Xiaobo's small matter. Next morning, you find the whole paper is covered with a drop of oil. You say, it's mine. So Tibet is the drop of oil that's thrown on Norwegian paper. Liu Xiaobo is the other drop of oil that's thrown on Norwegian paper. Hence, the Tibet question is not about Tibetan people. It's not about Tibet. It's about you. Norway. Norwegian people. Why? We lost our country. Our people are suffering. Whether you speak for us or not, it reflects you. It doesn't reflect us. Our reality is suffering. Our reality is tragedy. Now, if you don't speak, it reflects who Norway is and Norwegians are. And silence is complicit. So no, we will not speak for either way. Then silence is complicit. If some tragedy is unfolding in the streets, if you don't speak, you're tolerating, accepting the tragedy because you allow the tragedy to happen in front of you. Right? Now, what is happening in Tibet that you can speak about? Freedom House Index says, 2 years ago, every year they come with Freedom Index. 2 years ago, they listed all the countries. And the least country in the whole world was Syria. And next was Tibet. Now, all of us read about Syria. How many of you knew that Tibet is the second least free country in the whole world? And no one speaks about it. Now, Reporters Without Borders has come out with a statement saying it's more difficult to get access to Tibet for journalists than North Korea. Now, everybody talks of North Korea because Mr. Kim fires his missile. And then it's more difficult to get access to Tibet, and no one talks about it. Why? It's in this excuse of how to interact with China. We all are fooling ourselves by how should we interact with China. No. Should you transform China or China transform you is the reality. And at the moment, Tibet issue is ignored because people want to talk about money. Now, hence, the choice is also very clear. If you don't speak about Tibet and Liu Xiaobao, what you're not doing is speaking out not just about human rights, about environmental rights. You're not for justice. You're not for freedom. You're not for democracy. You're not for Mahatma Gandhi. You're not for Dalai Lama. You are for injustice. You're for denial of freedom. You're for undemocratic system. You're for human rights violation. You're for environmental destruction. And you are not for Mahatma Gandhi, you are for Mao Zedong. Because that's the currency that's coming to Norway. And you're not for Dalai Lama, but you are for Xi Jinping, which is socialism with Chinese characteristic in new era. New era is the international frontier. So hence the issue of human rights is not just about Tibetan people, 6 million Tibetans. It's about you. Your conscience, your values, your principles, your constitution. Now, when I say this, you please don't take it personally, okay? You are the good guys who are in this room. I'm talking another boardroom, with three-piece suit and dark glasses with business suitcase. That's them. So that's the choice. Now, finally, let me end with Tibet is simply a not human rights issue. Also, it's a major international environmental issue. After Antarctica and Arctic, because I'm very next to Antarctica here, after Antarctica and Arctic, Tibet has the third largest reserve of ice. Hence, it's called Third Pole by Chinese environmentalists. And then, Tibet is the water tower of Asia. 10 major rivers of Asia flow from Tibet. Indus, Satluj, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salman, Mekong, Yangtze, Yellow River, Manu River. 1.4 billion people depend on water which is starting from Tibet. So it's not an issue of 6 million Tibetans, it's an issue of 1.4 billion. And also, the jet stream over Tibet, because I know Norway is cold, but Tibet is higher. It acts as the fridge or the cooler for the whole world. The jet stream over Tibet affects climate all the way to Latin America, Canada. In fact, a scientist in Quebec has said whether the winter is cold or warm in Canada is partly determined by Tibetan plateau. Whether the weather is warm or cold, or whether there's heat wave in Europe is partly determined by Tibetan plateau. In fact, one scientist in California, University of California, said, unless you understand the Tibetan plateau, you won't understand global warming and climate change. Because the Tibetan plateau and the Himalaya region is as important and as fragile as rainforest of Latin America. Now you go and cut 10 trees in rainforest in Latin America, Greenpeace will come and protest. But the destruction, environmental destruction, minerals exploited in Tibet, and how many people are talking about it? Now, the danger is this. Tibet has half its 2.5 million square kilometers of land, which is as big as Western Europe combined. It's a huge land. But 50% of Tibet is tundra or permafrost. It's frozen earth. As deep as 1 meter to 30 meters deep. Now, because of global warming, climate change, industrialization of Tibet, urbanization of Tibet, because so many Chinese are moving in, Tibet is heating up, is warming up faster. Double the temperature rest of the world. Now what's happening is the permafrost is defreezing. When permafrost defreezes, what happens is that in that half the size of Tibet has 12,000 million tons of carbon dioxide under that. And equal number, around more than 1,000 million tons of methane is in the Tibetan plateau under permafrost. If permafrost defreezes, what happens is carbon dioxide comes out and pollutes the environment and creates a hole in the ozone layer. Now, methane is 30 times more stronger than carbon dioxide. If that is released, I'm so sorry. Doesn't matter how many Tesla or the electric energy cars that you buy, it's not going to contribute to lessening the temperature, because the release of carbon dioxide, release of methane will make this world so warm the Norwegian will not be able to ski in winter. And then if the 46,000 glaciers of Tibet, according to NASA, in 100 years, 50% disappeared. Of the remaining 46,000 glaciers that you have now, by 2100, at least 1/3, even 2/3 will disappear. If the 2/3 of Tibetan glacier disappear, what will happen to 1.4 billion people who are surviving on water flowing from Tibet? Now, some scientists say the wars are fought over land before, now wars are fought over oil. Soon wars will fought over water. Because China has 19% of the world population, but only 12% of fresh water, which means already 7% or 400 million Chinese are facing scarcity of fresh water. Situation in ASEAN is worse, situation in South Asia is worse, situation in India is worse. Now, Tibet is the water tower, and water crisis is happening in that part of the world. And you know, people say 21st century is century of Asia. Yes, economic growth is happening in Asia, and equally, the arms race, the largest number of arms are sold from everywhere to Asia. If there are so many guns, arms, water crisis come, it is a war. What will happen? So hence the impending crisis of carbon dioxide, methane getting released, global warming, glaciers melting, lack of water resources, all this is related to Tibet. And Tibet is the source of all these issues. Hence, let me conclude by saying, how should we interact? Liberal democracy should interact with China is not the question. You have no choice. China wants to transform you, the rest of the world. Now, whether you transform China like you or not is the choice. And Tibet is the battleground. Tibet is the litmus test. And I hope that I don't have to come back to Civita Forum every year to make the case. I hope when I go back, I'll come here in summer and enjoy good weather and nice people and nice country. And then I'll welcome you, all of you, to Tibet, where Tibet will look more like Norway than what the Freedom House Index says. And Tibet will have His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because 150 Tibetans have burned themselves so far. They have committed self-immolation. And we condemn self-immolation, we discourage self-immolation, but 150 Tibetans have burned themselves with a simple cry, a universal and unanimous cry. We want to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama return to Tibet. We want to see freedom for Tibetan people. I know some political leader in Norway abandoned Liu Xiaobao. And I hope Norway, who has also given Nobel Peace Prize to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, will not be abandoned, but rather we will march together and take and bring His Holiness the Dalai Lama back to Tibet, where he belongs, with 6 million Tibetan people. That's my hope, that's my dream, and that's my appeal to you all. So you all are good guys. Thank you.
Thank you.